all that jazz. So it can come up very quickly on you, and even if you leave it for a better time, there might not be a better time. So I always like to start talking about the final paper as early as possible so that you have time to start working through it. I also went back and I revised it a little bit from the one that they gave me from the college because I found it a bit limiting, and I like to give more options than what they had on the original essay. So I want to talk about that today. I also want to do the background information for the Victorian era because we're moving out of the Romantics and into the Victorians. Next week we have on Tuesday some poetry, and then on Thursday we're going to start reading The Importance of Being Earnest, starting on the 15th. So it's a 3-act play. So we'll do act 1 on one day, and then, an act each day. You can see on the calendar here. I'm going to tell you, maybe this is a bonus for the people who are present and the people who watch the videos later. I'm going to tell you that we're going to watch the video production of The Importance of Being Earnest in class. So I know this isn't a popular thing for an English teacher to say, but it's not 100% necessary for you to read it. Did I say that? I just feel like everybody's stressed, everybody is overworked. Maybe it's a good time to work on your paper. So if it's a matter of, do I read this act of Importance of Being Earnest, or do I work on my paper? I think you should work on your paper. And that way, when you come to class on those 3 days, so that will be April 15th, 20th, and 22nd. When you come those days, I'm going to give you some general things about that act, and then we're going to watch it in performance. So I think you get what I'm saying, that if you just attend classes on those days, I think you'll get enough of The Importance of Being Earnest. And I'm trying to find ways to alleviate some of your stress. It's not possible for me in certain cases. There are requirements that have to happen. I have to give you an exam. I have to do the paper. But nobody says that I have to make you read The Importance of Being Earnest. So maybe that will be a good time for you. There's discussions that are in there that you have to do, but maybe be a good time also for you to have more time to work on your paper. You could wait until, the weekend before the paper's due. The paper's due on the 4th if you wanted to, but I have a feeling you're going to have other stuff going on that week anyway. So let's talk about the essay first, and then we'll finish off with the intro into the Victorian era. I did make this is not your class. They're all the same, but I did make the new module visible for you. So if you go to course content, you'll see that the Victorian age is set up there. And you've got the same sections that we have. I try to keep it consistent through the different time periods so that you can always find what you're looking for. There's the background sort of general stuff. I'm going to touch on that today in the PowerPoint. The objectives for the unit. Guess what? We're going to be reading and articulating responses to literature. Here are the readings, which I just showed you on the calendar. I did make some smaller PDFs so that they're easier to manipulate. I don't know why it took me until April to figure out to do that. I just gave you those long PDFs, but as I started to make them for me showing you my annotations, I'm like, why don't I just give this to them? So I'm sorry, I apologize that that didn't occur to me earlier, but you do have a PDF packet of the selections for Tuesday. I'm going to go through most of the material from the textbook. There's like 22 pages in the textbook of background and history, and it goes way more in depth than we really need to go. So I'm going to give you the highlights in the PowerPoint, basically of what this section entails, but some of it also is in the part that says contextual notes. But do make sure that you read the poems for Tuesday. We're going to spend a good deal of time talking about them, what makes them Victorian in nature. We've been focusing on that for each unit, like what makes something a romantic piece, what makes something a Renaissance piece, how can we start to determine what are the qualities of each. So I'm going to spend some time with that. I'll tell you right now that The Cry of the Children is a little bit long, and so is The Lady of Shalott. I mean, they're worth it, and I'll be talking about them on Tuesday, but give yourself enough time. The others are short poems, but we'll talk about the poetry of the Victorian period, and then we'll delve into the play. And there's a PDF of the play, just the play from that big PDF is right here, and the background on Oscar Wilde. Contextual notes, these are usually the things that end up showing up on the exam as the short answer questions. So that's usually where those come from. There's only one discussion for this unit. It's due at the end of April, and it's on the importance of being earnest. Good news, The Importance of Being Earnest is a funny play. Well, it's a humorous play for, 19th century humor. It's not, 2020 humor, but it's funny, not a tragedy. It's not going to be depressing. It's not going to be, tragic. So much of literature is like that. But luckily, The Importance of Being Earnest is a little lighter piece. Here's where you can submit the essay, just in case you want to do that early. Technically, it's not really due until we're in the 6th and final unit. So I'll just move this submission to that unit when we move to that unit. But there are some people who told me they wanted to clear as much as they could out before exams. So there's some people who I know are going to be starting on their essay soon, and maybe they're going to submit early. So as usual here, here's the list of the different lectures. So as we go through these days, this is where I link you to not the Google Classroom, to the YouTubers, to the YouTube channel playlist, the different videos for each day, and then additional materials. So this is where the PowerPoint's going to come from. If you want to, I'm going to do in a little bit. If you want to follow along with the essay number 2 prompt, you can go back to essay 2 submission and click right there, or it's also on the calendar if you have that handy. So I want to talk about the essay for a little bit. This is really the first day that I'm talking about the essay. We'll talk about it a few more times as you start to work with your topics, and probably individually I'll talk to you about how your paper's going if you submit it to me or you ask me a question. But probably also, I have it on the calendar a couple of different times before the paper's due to just do a little check-in here in class to see how it's going. So, I don't expect a whole lot of questions today, but certainly if you have them, ask them so that I can talk about them. But the overall idea of the paper is similar in some ways to the first semester research paper. It's the same length, 6 to 8 pages. And you have 3 options. When I got this assignment from the college, there were no options. It was just what you see here is option 3. Everybody's doing that same essay. I don't like to do that. I like for students to be able to customize as much as possible what they're spending a lot of time on for the course. I would prefer you to pick something that's interesting to you from our material, from the time periods and authors and pieces, because I think that motivates you more to work on it. If you have to do a report on something that you don't really care about, it doesn't interest you, I don't think you learn as much. And I don't think that you're as eager to get it done, or you just sort of like want to get it over with and not really learn from it. So I added 2 other options. So you're going to be able to choose between 3 options, but basically the focus is on research. So you'll use MLA as usual. You need at least 5 sources, which sounds like a lot. But since it's a research paper and you're not including your own ideas, your own analysis, your own interpretation, you're just bringing in what other people have had to say about your topic, 5 isn't really that many. There is a stipulation that 3 of them need to come from the JSTOR database. Some people are familiar with that. Maybe some people are not familiar with that. I had a lot of people who were telling me on the last research paper that they were struggling to find sources. And I said, well, did you go to JSTOR? And some people didn't know what that was. I don't remember if it was in this class or not. So 3 of them need to come from JSTOR, meaning that they're going to be from a journal, right? Like from a database of scholarly articles. I put some links down here. So if you need to learn about JSTOR, there's a lady who's going to walk you through it here. If you need help searching, like if you know about JSTOR and you've searched through that database, but you can never really find, like the things that come up don't really help you, then this video might be good. This will help you refine your search process in JSTOR. And then here's the link where you can actually, click on it and go into JSTOR to search the database. You do have to log in with your STC info, but there are those links right there on the assignment, so it shouldn't be too hard. If you're working and you have trouble coming up with articles, definitely contact me. I'll find some for you. I'll point you in some directions to help you out. You don't have to, try to make things work. You shouldn't have that problem though. The topics I think are wide enough. The goal is to demonstrate a thorough understanding of the contribution of works, authors, and literary periods to the whole of British literature. So you're going to basically choose 1, 2, or 3. You're either going to focus on a work of literature, an author, or a literary period and discuss what scholars have had to say about how that contributed to English literature as we know it today. So you could choose a work, an author, or a literary period. I'm going to go into a little more detail about that, and I have some questions and like an explanation of each of the options below. But I do have a highlighted element here, and I know that it's kind of overkill to bold, underline, and highlight, but I did have a couple of papers last term that were supposed to be research papers, but there was no research. It was just an opinion paper. It was an analysis paper. And those papers did not pass. So I don't want that to happen. I just want to remind you that a research paper on its basic level is you gathering information and then finding a logical way to organize and present that information. So you don't need to come up with an interpretation. You don't need to come up with an opinion on your topic. All you have to do is say, look, I studied these scholars and this is what these scholars have to say about this topic. And organize it in a way that makes sense and flows and all of that stuff. We're kind of starting out. This is your first semester of really looking at British literature in detail, but there are people who've been studying it for their entire careers and they write papers. And so we can just take their ideas and explain this is what these people have had to say about this topic. All right, I don't see anything in the chat, so I'm assuming there's no questions so far. Let's look at the 3 options. So option number 1 is focusing on a work of literature, a literary movement. So say you really just liked, above all the other units that we worked on this semester, you really, really liked the Romantics. So then you can just kind of take that as your topic. What do we owe to the writers of the Romantic period for the richness of today's English language and literature? How did the people writing during that time get us or contribute to, the evolution of English literature like we see it today? So you can choose from any of the 6 literary periods. We're just starting the 5th one. There's still a 6th one, which is modernism. I don't know if that's going to be viable for you because the paper might be due too soon. But anyway, you can definitely look into the 6th one if you want. And research how that period contributed to the whole of English literature. In what ways did this period help build the legacy of modern English literature? So what's the role that the Romantics or the people writing in the Renaissance or the Middle Ages, what's their role in building English literature or language or both? So that's a movement. And the next one is focusing just on one author. Now, we did a snack version of British literature. We kind of like picked at this and ate a little bit across the top. The only thing we really read in its entirety was Beowulf and Othello and the poems. But we didn't study multiple, vast amounts of work from each author. So option 2, if you say to yourself, well, I more than anything, I really enjoyed Canterbury Tales. I really enjoyed Chaucer, and I know that he was a great contributor to English literature. So I really want to focus on his work, not just Canterbury Tales, all of his work. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go and read all of his work. There's no way that can happen in time to do the paper. But what do scholars have to say in general about the work of Chaucer? How has that come into play with explaining how English literature is most important? Oh, thanks. That's a lot. Oh, okay. All right. Mr. Ramos is bringing me lunch. So how does the work of one author impact the growth of English literature? And there's some questions here to help you think about that. Now, I did originally I put in here that I want you to choose an author that we've studied this term. I think that's your best bet. But if there's an author that we did not study, I don't want to close that off to you. You would have to go and read some of that person's work, pick somebody maybe out of your textbook so that you can find it easily, some of their work. But do let me know so that I can maybe talk to you about what you should read and help you with some resources for that if you choose somebody that we did not study. The third option is the one that they originally had for the paper. The first two are the ones that I added just to make it easier to approach the assignment. But option 3 is still a good one. I just like options. So number 3 is about the analysis of one text. Say you really liked The Pardoner's Tale, and you really want to focus your research on what scholars have had to say over the years on The Pardoner's Tale. Well, you can choose option 3, and you can try to look at how that piece can be viewed through at least 2 different critical lenses. So this is a critical lens option. How can we use feminism to look at Othello? Scholars have written on that, undoubtedly. Or how can we use psychoanalysis to look at what happens to Othello in the course of the play? So in this one, you're going to choose 2 different critical lenses that are very different and show how one piece of literature can be looked at from this angle and then also from this angle using what scholars have had to say through the lenses. So you would do a search for feminist criticism, Othello, feminist criticism, Gulliver's Travels, feminist criticism, Wife of Bath's Tale, whatever it is that you're interested in, whichever text you're interested in looking at. This document also has a whole bunch of information. You can choose any of these 4 lenses. There are more lenses than this, but these are the 4 that they have here in the paper. I think we did all of them first semester. So you might need a refresher. If you do, there's all kinds of information here. There's a little overview here, and then there's more information. They went and got some source information. You can quote this document because they put in the bibliographical information after each thing here. I didn't put this together, they did from the college, but this is where they're indicating their sources here. And so then each one of the types, you have more information there, and you can use that as one of your sources, this document. If you do that and you need help citing it, just let me know. We'll figure it out. So those are basically the 3. I think in terms of timing, it would be good to spend maybe this next, few days, maybe the next week, thinking about which of the 3 topics you're most interested in, which author, which time period, which piece, and maybe write a thesis. You can always shoot it to me and say, hey, I decided on option 2. Here's my thesis. What do you think? Do you have any recommendations for sources? Stuff like that. And I will help you and give you feedback. And that way, maybe it keeps you going and gets it finished before you run into problems with too many things at the end of the term. But we don't have a discussion this week. So it's giving me an opportunity to catch up on grading the last 2 that I need to do. And also maybe you could start looking at the paper and just start to think about what are the topics that you would like to do. Any questions? Like I said, we'll revisit the paper. I think I have it on the schedule for the 22nd, but I'll probably talk about it next week too. We don't have class next Friday, but one of these 2 days I can talk about it a little bit also in case you're starting to have questions. But I'll bring it up at that point. I don't see anything in the chat. So I guess that's my signal to move on to the Victorian era. The other two sources can be from any scholarly page. Yeah. So 3 of them, let me go back to the thing here. 3 of them need to be from JSTOR specifically. That's a qualification of the paper. Then the other 2 can be from any other scholarly page. I'm getting a question in the chat. So yeah, but make sure that it's a legit scholarly page, not, Uncle Fred's, opinions on Paradise Lost. So yeah, just like usual. Or books from a library. That's sort of old fashioned, I guess. But yeah, 3 of them need to be from JSTOR. So they want you to demonstrate that you can use the databases that are intended for research in this field, which is mainly JSTOR. Good question. All right, you can keep, if you do have other questions on the research paper as you think about it, I'm gonna be going through the PowerPoint on Victorian era, but if something occurs to you, just put it in the chat and I'll touch on it before we go today. So if you go to additional materials, then you will see this is the PowerPoint that I'm about to go through in case you want a copy for yourself in your little Google, what's it called? Google Drive. As always, before we start a new unit, I want to talk about the Victorian era literature and a little bit of the history. This kind of covers that section of the book that has background about the time period, minus all the details about the monarchy that we don't really need. So the Victorian era is obviously named after Queen Victoria, who ascends to the throne in 1837. And she's on the throne for quite some time. She dies in 1901. And during this time, we equate a lot of the growth and success of Britain to her reign. Queen Victoria was much beloved, and you can tell because under her, the country and the empire expanded to its greatest level. So basically the time period that we're talking about is 1830s to 1901, but it's generally the time of the reign of Queen Victoria. So we're continuing to see unprecedented growth in the towns. Imagine that a town grew from 2 million people to 6.6 million people just in the, 60 years of her reign. So there's a huge tripling of the amount of people that inhabited London, mainly because of industrialization and the fact that transportation is moving along and there are easier ways to travel, railroads, that sort of thing, steam power. There's even better communication. The world's getting a little bit smaller because of the way that people can travel more easily and communicate more easily with using the telegraph and telegram and things like that. Also, photography is invented during this time period. So we're starting to see a sort of tightening of understanding of the world through photographs, and universal education, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Anesthetics, all of those advancements help the growth of the country. There are also problems though, just as there are benefits, there are also problems, and they're not new problems. They're the same problems that we've been seeing lingering since, the 17th century. Homelessness, poverty, unregulated industrialization. The factories still don't have regulations about workload or the ages of people who can work. It does change during this time period. There's a lot of reforms in society and in government that help the average person who is living in Britain to have a better life somewhat. One of those reforms are class structure reforms. So where previous to the Victorian era, the only people who could vote or serve in parliament were people of the aristocracy. You had to be a landowner to the level of having an estate. If you were a guy who worked on a farm, or if you were a lady who worked at, well, forget ladies, they don't even vote. But if you were a person who lived in the city and was a worker in the factory, you didn't vote, and you weren't allowed to run for any kind of political position. That was only for the aristocracy, but that gets reformed during this time. And they changed the right for voting to allow anybody who owns property worth more than 10 pounds. So anybody who has the tiniest little plot of land now can vote. Well, any man, because the women couldn't own property and therefore couldn't vote. So those things are starting to slowly change as we get through the Victorian era. Under Queen Victoria, Parliament gets reconstructed a little bit. They start to allow for different voices from different places to be part of Parliament. That doesn't really open up until a little bit later on. But the main reason for that is because there were a lot of strikes and threats. The workers demanded that the government do something about regulating their work and their labor. So there are these threats of rebellion, and there were strikes. There were times where people didn't show up to work to make a point about how they needed regulations. And so that kind of scared people into making some, not comprehensive changes, but it's starting to move in a more humane direction. We also have the global commerce. Just in a matter of 20 years, the global commerce through Britain tripled, because steam-powered boats and other conveyances started to allow for quicker trade. This is also when Britain expands into its greatest size as an empire, mainly because of colonialism. And so Britain went into places like Canada and the West Indies and India and Africa, and basically tried to colonize existing locations. Now, this is not something that's looked back upon with any kind of dignity. It's an embarrassment that colonialization occurred, but it happened. So the British Empire sort of, the aristocrats went into Africa and they said to the native people there, or India or wherever, we're refined and civilized people from Europe, so we're here to be your overlords. And you will now serve us, and we will take all of the resources from your country and sell it and send them back to our country and make money off of it. Thank you very much. And that is a horrible thing to do to people. But think about it, even the colonies in America did that to the Native Americans. So it's a mindset that is shameful, but it's a mindset that existed at the time. So we look back on colonialization as kind of an embarrassment and a social grievance. But you can still see evidence of colonialism in those places. You can still go to India and see, evidence of colonialism and the mansions that were built there, and so on and so forth from the Europeans. Okay, also during this time is the humbling of humanity. Darwin is doing his theories about this time. So we start to get questions about, evolution and how could we prove where human beings originated and that sort of thing. It's not particularly germane to the British people, but this is the time of the US Civil War and the recovery antebellum. So it wouldn't have affected the British people on a daily basis, but they were aware that there was a civil war going on in the United States. And we're not reading American literature. If we were, we would be reading a lot about the war, and we'd be reading diaries and letters and things like that. But we're not, but just kind of mentally, you can overlap the time period with that Civil War time. And last but not least, women's suffrage. We've been seeing this coming because of Mary Wollstonecraft, but women's suffrage starts to take the forefront during the Victorian era. The definition of femaleness is in question because of Wollstonecraft and other writers who are starting to say, hey, wait a minute. Let's think about what the role of women might be in this society that's moving forward. How come we're not moving forward with the idea of what women are capable of doing? And so there were some legal battles that started to set precedents in Britain having to do with divorces, which before this were not even considerations. Voting, we have the suffrage movement, we have the right to hold property. I mean, imagine if you are the daughter, say you're the firstborn of a wealthy aristocrat with multiple estates, and you have a younger brother. Well, you're going to get something from your family's estate, but your brother's going to inherit the estate. And when you do get something from your parents' estate, it's going to be given to your husband, not you, because women could not hold property. So the injustice in that they sort of start to wake up and go, why can't women hold property? And there were cases in court that started to call those rules into question. Also, women started to fight for custody of their children. A lot of times, if women desperately wanted out of a marriage, they would just leave, but they would have to leave their children behind because those children are the heirs to, the estate. So there starts to be a little bit more equality, or at least questioning in the courts about whether or not these are just and moral rules. And of course, women attending college, they had to oftentimes sue in order to allow themselves and go into legal battles in order to continue their education, which is a direct result of writers like Mary Wollstonecraft. All right, moving on to characteristics of Victorian literature. A lot more literacy. At the beginning of the Victorian era, half the adult men could read and write. By 1900, almost everybody had basic literacy. Almost everybody knew what the alphabet was, and that's because of universal education. Universal education means that everybody can go to school, which is sort of a basic thing for us, but the idea that, even kids of poor families could go to school. And it wasn't just the wealthy that sent their kids to school. So more and more literacy starts to occur by 1900. Also, it's cheaper to buy books. So schools can purchase books and students can read from those books. Prior to the Victorian era, or maybe like before the Romantics, that was difficult. Books were expensive. They were done on, like hand done presses, and now we have steam powered presses, so they can very quickly make more and more and more copies. So there are newspapers and all kinds of explosion of different types of literature. Family reading as entertainment comes into play, and I would put a star by this one, the rise of the novel. The rise of the novel and short fiction, just fiction in general, really expands, and this is really the first period where we see the novel in the first place. So the novel takes stage in the Victorian era, and most of the novels in general were trying to represent the social strata of the time. Usually they had tons of characters. The master, of course, is Charles Dickens. If you haven't read Great Expectations or Oliver Twist, Tale of Two Cities, you should read one of those before you die. Also, they tend to span long periods of time. So, for example, Great Expectations, at the beginning, the protagonist is like 8 years old, and at the end, he's like 30. So these are wide sweeping novels that have a lot of characters. Women writers, the Brontes sisters are writing. A lot of other women writers are starting to be given a voice and a plateau and a spot in literature. We also have the rise of short fiction. Don't worry, we're almost done. The rise of short fiction. We have the Sherlock Holmes stories, Charles Dickens. I really wish that I could have put something by Charles Dickens into the unit because he's the big name in Victorian literature. Maybe you know A Christmas Carol. That's the story of Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Past, the Ghost of Christmas Present. That's Charles Dickens. And Rudyard Kipling. History has not been kind to Rudyard Kipling because he mainly wrote colonial tales from the perspective of the overlords. So now we look back on it and it's kind of cringy because we look back and say that was not a fair practice. Reimagining of the poetic voice. So in poetry, we have more experiments now with the speaker, who the speaker is. On Tuesday, we'll talk about dramatic monologue. I put a link here just in case you wanted to go and read about that. We're going to read a dramatic monologue for Tuesday, and I'll talk about why it's a dramatic monologue and all that stuff. And the continuation of art for art's sake. Now, in the Victorian times, some people stuck with that idea of the ideal, right? If things are kind of overrun and there's these questions about, you know, poverty and that sort of thing, some people like to escape that. And so they write about the ideal still, like we saw with the Romantics. Other people like to highlight in their writing the suffering of humanity so as to improve it. So some writers would write about how deplorable the situations are so that they could get some attention and maybe some outrage, and then maybe some laws changed or something intervening for people who were suffering. So we do see some elements of the Romantic period lingering, but it's sort of dominated by conscience and the idea that writers felt like they needed to champion the causes of people who were suffering. Drama flourished, theaters opened like crazy. Here are some key authors. I sometimes think about not putting their pictures up there because they always seem so grumpy. But here's Charles Dickens. And you would look at that and go, I don't know if I want to read anything by that guy. I mean, look, he's got a weird hairdo and that frizzy beard. But we can't judge people on how they look, right? So, but that's what he looked like, Charles Dickens. This is Elizabeth Barrett Browning. We're going to read some of her poetry for Tuesday. She was married to Robert Browning. I have to point out, I think last year I used this PowerPoint and the students were freaking out because they thought that young Elizabeth Barrett Browning was married to old Robert Browning because of the way I did these pictures. But Elizabeth Barrett Browning didn't live to old age. Robert Browning was like her age. They were about the same age. It wasn't that, you know, this 75-year-old guy married, you know, some 20-year-old girl. It's just that this is a picture of him when he was old, and the other one's a picture of her when she was young. Robert Browning will be reading from a dramatic monologue from his work. The last author is Oscar Wilde, who is the author of The Importance of Being Earnest, the play that we're going to be gearing up for next week. He also wrote The Nightingale and the Rose. I think we read that first semester, right? Remember the bird? I think we did in this class. Maybe I'm thinking about AP. But the social commentary about greed and youth. And so he's a very satirical and funny writer. Well, you know, 1800s funny. But that's Oscar Wilde, the author. That's the end of the background information on Victorian era. I don't see any additional comments in the chat about the paper or about the Victorian age. I'm going to flip back to the readings. So for Tuesday, just make sure that you have read the material that's here. I pretty much went over this stuff here from the Victorian period. So mainly focus on the poems and be prepared to go over those with me on Tuesday. Are there any questions? I don't see any. Maybe you will after you think a little bit more about the paper, but we'll touch on that next week if need be. So I guess I'm going to cut you loose. I hope that you all have a good rest of your Friday and a nice weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday. All right. Have a good day.
All right. Bye, Miss.
Bye, Miss.
Bye.